Good. Okay, well, we are going to do a bit of a tag team here. I'll talk first, then Charles, and then I will come back for some conclusions. Before I start, I want to, on behalf of both of us, thank the organizers, our chancellor, and the presidents of both of the academies for the opportunity to be here. It's really a privilege, and it's actually been a very enjoyable day. I've learned a lot. I'm also grateful for the break, because otherwise we would have been the only thing standing between you and a drink and a chance to stretch your legs, so that was really wonderful. We have a few main points we want to develop in this paper. And the first is that, I don't need to read them to you, but it's not so much biodiversity loss, but what we would call unwarranted biodiversity loss that we should be concerned with. People actually manage and, in cases, even reduce biodiversity for very good reasons attached to human well-being. It's the unintentional and unwarranted loss of biodiversity that should actually exercise us more. There are lots of costs to that unwarranted extinction. We will be developing those during the talk. Solutions that, at the very least, require investments in poverty reduction. And this is not to say that we are blaming the poor for decreases in biodiversity, but at least the biodiversity decreases, the unwarranted decreases, and even some of the warranted ones that are associated with habitat conversion are largely a problem in poor countries now. And there are also ethical as well as pragmatic reasons to be worried about this, and we'll be ending the talk with some of those ethical reasons. I actually thought we would have seen this before now. People have alluded to ecosystem services, and of course, many, if not most of you in the room know a lot about this topic. But ecosystem services are the sets of services that our natural capital delivers to humans to support their well-being, and they fall into four categories. There's supporting services, up there in the top left. Those are all the things we think of as ecosystems functions, the recycling of nutrients, the conversion of water, oxygen and CO2 exchanges that are essential for all other ecosystem functionings and services. There's the provisioning services, so these are the things that we eat, wear, build houses with, keep ourselves warm with. Regulating services, the sets of services that keep nature operating within certain bounds, tries to contain catastrophes such as fires or disease outbreaks, and then the cultural services, some of the recreational and spiritual services that we get from nature. And if you listen to some talks on biodiversity and ecosystem services, there is this sort of implicit message that increasing biodiversity always increases services. But again, a main point of this paper is going to be that human well-being is actually often best served by reducing biodiversity. We quite purposefully at times reduce biodiversity, either to gain something from the system or to protect ourselves from a harm. And just this one slide on global purposeful extinctions. Right? We have had several global campaigns to basically eradicate an entire set of organisms. Now, the ones that aren't indicated are viruses, and we can ask whether that's really life and therefore really eliminating a species. But in other cases, we clearly have agreed as a global society to actually try to purposefully create extinction with respect to these diseases. And that's just one end of a spectrum at which we make very conscious decisions to say we should, in the name of human well-being, actually reduce biodiversity. Now, this is not to say that the vast majority of extinctions that are taking place are warranted. That's certainly not the argument. But in pursuit of warranted reductions in biodiversity, we often cause unwarranted reductions in biodiversity. Now, whether this is a sin is a different question. Whether the global agreement to actually eradicate the guinea worm, which didn't succeed yet, is sinful is a different question. Nonetheless, in the absence of that constraint, or in the absence of the global leaders who engaged in this thinking that it was sinful, we have in fact made that commitment. Okay, I am going to, with that, turn it over to Charles. Your turn.
All right, thank you. So what I'm going to try and do here is to give the reasons why we think that it's only certain types of biodiversity loss that should exercise us, that we should focus on, and to say something about the things that might be done to address that problem. It turns out that, I mean, if you think of that diagram, that sort of flower diagram that Anne showed you with all of the ecosystem services on, that contains biodiversity as a service, which has always struck me as a really strange thing to do, since the mix of species is what delivers all of the other services. And you could think about habitat provision as being something of a service, but essentially we're interested in this set of problems because changes in biodiversity affect the things that people get from the ecosystems around them. That's what motivates any sort of anthropocentric concern over this problem. And in some cases, as Anne has said already, biodiversity increases well-being. In other cases, it reduces well-being. Pests and pathogens are the things that people have focused on more frequently than they've focused on almost anything else. Crop competitors, they've focused on. Weedy species, they've focused on. Predators of crops, predators of livestock, predators of people. We live in Arizona, a country, a state that has significant populations of rattlesnakes and scorpions. It would be very uncomfortable to have those routinely in one's house. And so we try to exclude them, and that's a perfectly rational thing to be doing. And if we just, on this slide, we had a couple of examples of the services that are advantaged by biodiversity. These are mostly regulating services where the mix of species is important. One example is livestock production in variable climates, which is increased in the range of palatable grass species that are adapted to different types of climate. Another example would be soil stability, which is increased by the range of species with different root traits. Those are both beneficial consequences of biodiversity. But the burden of disease is very much a problem in parts of the world where you have a wider range of disease agents of one kind or another, whether it's fungi, bacteria, or viruses. And those are areas in which one would like to see a reduction in biodiversity. So we've seen significant efforts to reduce biodiversity in the interests of producing foods, fuels, and fibers. We've seen people worry about health and safety and use that to reduce biodiversity. Is that wrong? No, we don't think it is wrong. But we also see incidental effects of attempts to simplify ecosystems that are significantly damaging to human well-being, and those are the ones we're concerned with here. So we're not so much concerned with changes that enhance human well-being writ large. We are concerned with changes that damage human well-being writ large. The things that we worry about are what we're calling unwarranted biodiversity loss. And that does include the biodiversity loss that most people here are talking about. Extinction of wild living species. But it also includes loss that reduces a very important public good, the global gene pool. It includes loss that compromises production of useful ecosystem services, or loss that reduces our ability to respond adaptively to environmental change. The regulating services are extremely important in enabling us to adapt effectively to environmental change. So, what drives unwarranted biodiversity loss? Well, some of this has already been alluded to, particularly by Partha. Much unwarranted biodiversity loss occurs because we don't have good signals. Either we don't have good physical measures, we don't understand the physical consequences of biodiversity change, or the individuals whose actions are responsible for biodiversity change are not facing market prices, signals to them that determine whether or not they treat their actions in one way or in another. So if you're, the point Partha made, which I think was an extremely good one, is that if you have open access, it means you're systematically underpricing the resources to which you have open access. And people respond to that. They respond in ways that don't recognize the importance of the resources at hand. Many examples of that, and examples would include off-site impacts of pollution of one kind or another, nutrient runoff from farms and so on, would also include invasive pests and pathogens. So our paper is largely about the role of poverty. And Anne has already mentioned that what we're not trying to do is to say that biodiversity loss is visited on us by poor people and they are to blame. That's not the intent of this. But it does turn out that the behavior of poor people in the tropical regions of the Earth may be implicated in biodiversity change in ways that we feel very uncomfortable with. And why? Because everyone makes decisions subject to constraints. Poor people are no different from rich people in making decisions subject to constraints, but the constraints they face are different. The information available to them is different. The resources that they have available to them are very different. The world they live in is a different world, so the decisions they're likely to make are different. And we've identified poverty as one of the drivers of decisions that, looked at after the fact, appear to be both parochial and myopic. Poor people have to worry about feeding their family today. They can't afford to worry about deferring the consequences of actions for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. They have to worry about their immediate community. They can't afford to worry about communities that are halfway across the world. And then what we're concerned with is that this is a very intractable problem to which we currently don't have very many good solutions, but it does seem to us that it's a problem where there are solutions, and what we're going to try and do is explore some of those. So the direct connection between the actions of the rural poor in agricultural societies and biodiversity change is the habitat loss that comes from extensive agricultural growth. Agriculture grows in two different ways, either by improving efficiency, which is called intensive growth, or by extending the area of land that's cultivated, and that's called extensive agricultural growth. And it's the latter that's the problem. Extensive agricultural growth, more so than intensive growth, has negative impacts on habitat and therefore the species associated with that habitat. But it isn't just the clearance of habitat. Application of nutrients has off-site effects. Application of pesticides has off-site effects. Both of those things cause collateral damage to other species. The difficulty is that farmers don't currently have very much incentive to take those effects into account. Their interest is going to be ensuring that they have enough to get by for the next month, their families are fed. It's not going to be in mitigating the off-site consequences of their actions. There is a very strong, close connection observed in this paper by Sachs et al. Between the incidence of poverty and the species richness of the world, which is concentrated in tropical areas, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in South Asia. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about relates to these areas, to sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but also to South Asia. The links between biodiversity loss, poverty, and the rest of the world are manifold, but we'll talk about just two. One is the connection between the changes that occur when you push agriculture into wild lands and the movement of species across the globe. So at that margin where you're pushing agriculture into wild lands, you're bringing species into contact with one another and allowing the emergence of, in particular, zoonotic or epizootic diseases. Diseases that cross species boundaries that may either impact people elsewhere or else impact livestock elsewhere. Most of the diseases that are faced by people around the world are, most of the infectious diseases are zoonotic in origin. And the image on the right of this slide derives from a paper by Jones et al., who showed that the origin of those zoonotic epidemics that have occurred in the northern parts of the world is almost always in the south, the global south, and in particular in tropical areas which are being characterized by having wildlife brought into contact with livestock and with people. There's one set of costs there. Note that those same zoonotic diseases are imposing harms in the countries where they occur, but the financial costs tend to be realized elsewhere in the world. So globally, we spend something like 10% of GDP on health of one kind or another. That's not just infectious diseases, it's all kinds of health. Ranges from something like 1.5% in East Timor to 17% plus in the United States. Big, big range. If you take a look at the burden of disease, just in terms of how many people fall ill of what different kinds of diseases, you get a picture which shows that there's no strong correlation between the burden of disease and health expenditures. If there is one, it's a negative one. So for example, sub-Saharan Africa and India around the turn of the century carried more than 40% of the burden of disease, but less than 2% of health expenditures. If you look, on the other hand, at the developed economies in the same period, 2% of the burden of disease, nearly 90% of health expenditures. Things haven't changed very much since then in terms of that balance. So the financial cost of diseases that emerge in the poorest countries is carried in the richest countries. Not necessarily the highest disease cost, but the highest financial cost. So what's to do about this kind of issue? We've got to recognize that for many of the countries where the behavior of the rural poor is an immediate proximate driver of biodiversity change, their primary concern has got to be poverty alleviation. And we would be misguided if we were to say that there was anything wrong with that priority. And for many of those countries, if they're going to alleviate poverty in circumstances where 60% of the people live in rural areas, the only road to that is through agricultural growth. And typically in the absence of effective credit markets, the absence of abilities to invest in new technologies and so on, that's going to turn into extensive growth. So people trying to dig themselves out of poverty are going to be expanding the area under committed to agriculture. So we have a problem. And if we believe that the global cost of the biodiversity loss that causes is too high, then it behooves us to invest in the alleviation of poverty directly. So I think what we're arguing for is, if you recognize there's a strong connection here, then you should also recognize that the solution to that is going to be fairly massive investment in the poorest of the poor. That there is no very good alternative to doing it in this way. That the examples that we've had of piecemeal conservation and development projects have been very weak. The examples we've had of locking out protected areas and then leaving the people on the margins of those protected areas to deal with their own problems, those haven't been very effective. We need something akin to a Marshall Plan to deal with the environmentally sustainable development of the poorest of the poor. This should pay a lot of dividends, not just in terms of biodiversity loss, but in terms of a range of other global problems. Environmental refugees are just one source of the flow of refugees. The moment we're exercised by other flows, other sources of the flow of refugees. But there's one concern that drives people everywhere who are moving across boundaries, and that's their inability to make a decent living in the place from which they're fleeing. So what should we be doing if we're thinking about this kind of thing? We should be developing a strategy that A, has a target on those poorest countries, and B, that takes into account environmental consequences of alternatives. A lot of the solutions here are quite well known. We already know that there is a real payoff to agricultural intensification. We know that there is a huge payoff to developing non-agricultural employment opportunities, extending educational opportunities, and so on. We know that there is a real benefit to establishing secure property rights and to building the capacity of people to raise funds to invest in their own, improve their own conditions. But there are some other things that we can do. These other things may be a little bit less common, but they include something that's already been referred to, I believe, by Gretchen, the use of investment zones, land use zones to complement protected areas. It seems to me a fundamental mistake that we should be protecting 10% of the world's surface fully and neglecting 90% of the world's surface. Ideally, what we think we should be doing is protecting 100% of the world's surface in appropriate ways. And zoning is one way to think about extending protection to the rest of the world's surface. Other things would be the separation of agricultural production zones from wild habitat. There's a big benefit to reducing the likelihood of cross-species contact. Extending property rights to include genetic material. A second potential cost of agriculture at the moment is that poor farmers have a strong incentive to adopt the most high-yielding crops. There was a question about the Green Revolution. I think, Bernie, you raised that question earlier on. One consequence of the Green Revolution, a really important consequence, has been the adoption of high-yielding crops and the abandonment of land races and the abandonment of any traditional protections over wild crop relatives. That's reduced the genetic material available to future crop breeding. And if you would like to protect the ability to adapt to future environmental change in agriculture, one of the best things that you could do would be to provide farmers with A, property rights in land races, and B, an incentive to protect them in situ, to conserve them in situ. And the last thing, well, there's two things. One, to address this issue of common pool resources. Common pool resources are amongst the most difficult to regulate effectively. This is true on land, but of course it's also true on sea. Jane was reasonably optimistic about the potential for dealing with the high seas problem which is classically a common pool resource allocation problem, it remains way more difficult to address that problem than it does to address anything within the exclusive economic zones. And the same kind of issues we observe on land. So institutional reforms that allow you to deal with common pool resources are an important part of the story. And then finally, incentives. Get incentives right. Now those incentives can be the conventional incentives that economists talk about all the time, such as taxes and subsidies and the like that come from national governments. But they could also be investments from other sources. So the last point in our set of solutions before Anne addresses the ethical issues here relates to how one might go about funding investment in the poorest of the poor. Here there's some bad news stories, but there's also a good news story. So the bad news story is that most of the investment that's taken place in the past has come from bilateral, multilateral government-to-government development assistance and is vanishingly small in some instances and is increasingly unlikely in the climate of today. A more hopeful option since its inception has been the Global Environment Facility, because that at least is established to provide international funds for the provision of global environmental public goods, but it remains severely underfunded. A better option right now would be direct investment, either by private foundations, which have the deepest pockets right now, or by non-governmental organizations, or potentially by harnessing private corporations. I'm less confident about private corporations than about private foundations, mainly because by the time you get to the private foundation, you're buying your way into heaven in any event, and that provides you with a quite strong motivation. But just to put it in perspective, the Global Environment Facility, all countries coming together to fund protection of the global environment, has yielded something like $10 billion. The Gates Foundation, operating over the same period, came up with something like $26 billion. One foundation. There's significant resources that's available to invest in the poorest of the poor countries. It's what the Gates Foundation has been doing already. And we hope that it's possible to think about alternatives that match that in the future. I'll turn back to Anne.
Okay, so just to end with some of the ethical rather than practical dimensions of the problem. There are a lot of reasons to move forward, as Charles and I have tried to develop in the paper, but we should do so with eyes open, that there are still some pitfalls in terms of the social justice issues that might face action. So there are some reasons to be concerned both about trying to avoid unwarranted biodiversity loss and efforts to mitigate that loss. The first, and we're not going to develop that further, it's talked about in the paper, is that the poor are simply more dependent on the natural resource base than the rich are. And so when we do see unwarranted biodiversity loss, the poor are just much more likely to suffer. This is true all the way from household level scales to national level scales. Poor households are more likely to suffer, poor nations are more likely to suffer. For all the good things that can be said about economics, it's still a system in which $1 equals one vote. And so the poor are just less likely to either have the dollars to vote in the marketplace for the outcomes that they want, or to have the property rights that allow their interests to be reflected in the decision-making process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Finally, there is a fairly pervasive win-win narrative for development and biodiversity. For all the good that Jeff Sachs has done in the world, there is this story that's told that the way to protect biodiversity is to allow development. And while both of those things absolutely have to occur, we have to alleviate poverty, and we also have to simultaneously protect biodiversity, the bottom line is that from the poorest levels, as wealth increases, biodiversity actually suffers. And if we don't recognize the possibility for that relationship, then we go in with this notion that it's a win-win scenario and we don't have to take the appropriate protections, we either don't accomplish the protection of biodiversity, or we don't accomplish poverty alleviation, or we miss on both counts. I have to say, though, that if you look at the literature, you look at the history of integrated conservation and development projects, you look at narratives of large-scale land acquisition, which I'm going to talk about, you get far more argument from narrative, from a few case studies and then extrapolation than from statistically rigorous longitudinal cross-case study comparisons. This is just really hard to do, to tease apart those complex interactions between development, poverty, and biodiversity loss. I want to reflect just on this one piece of it, that the poor are less likely to have the property rights that allow their interests to be reflected in decision-making, or that allow them to benefit when the right decisions are made. There's a phenomenon now called large-scale land acquisition. It's a case where significantly large tracts of land are leased by foreign governments or foreign corporations for up to 100 years. And a lot of this is taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. There's two different narratives out there about the benefits or costs of large-scale land acquisition. One narrative is promoted by places like the World Bank and even national level governments that say this is an important source of foreign direct investment and capacity building in these countries, that people can learn better farming techniques, roads can be developed, markets can be developed, and this is a positive thing. And then there's another narrative that basically says it deprives local people of their livelihoods. And again, much of the argument in this area has been through narrative. There are some data, but the data are lacking. So one of my graduate students, Ernest Nkonsa-Dwamina, has undertaken both a case study up to a regional statistical analysis of both the drivers of LASLA, large-scale land acquisition, and the impacts. So at the regional level, he looked at 20 countries for which he had enough data in 5 categories to see what drove investments in large-scale land acquisition. Was the positive narrative going to hold? What we were really seeing was chances for capacity building, infrastructure development, or was the negative narrative going to hold? So he had demographic variables, economic variables, natural resources, how much water is there, ease of doing business, and measures of governance. And what he found, a bit soberingly, was that investment in large-scale land acquisition increased with increasing government effectiveness. On the face of it, that sounds really good, until you look at the fact that it decreased with increasing regulatory quality and decreased with the rule of law, which includes a measure of property rights. And one way, and probably the most reasonable way to interpret this, is that investors are seeking countries where it's easy to make an agreement. You can find a government to make an agreement with, but there's little enforcement afterwards. And so again, it's the people on the ground who are going to be affected by these large-scale land acquisitions are being offered very few protections in the places that are getting the most attention for this investment. For those of you interested in global funding for conservation, this paper by Arun Agarwal and Dan Miller actually provides some of the most comprehensive data on total flows. So not just that spent by conservation organizations, but by development agencies, by the intergovernmentals. They tried to add up the various categories of where people are investing in conservation. And the only thing I want to note here, again, is the relatively low investments in sub-Saharan Africa relative to the poverty challenges and the conservation challenges. There's some good reasons for that, having again to do with governance, but if we're going to try to get out in front of some of the problems that we're facing with biodiversity decline, rather than reacting to where it's declining in the here and now, not that it's not also declining in Africa, we need some proactive investments in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, this could be an entire lecture. The win-win narratives are problematic, and we have decades of experience with a win-win narrative called integrated conservation and development projects. And even though Stuart and Peter talked about some examples this morning where that has worked, I would say on a global scale, it's less often worked. So the biodiversity outcomes in these cases are often measured by the desires of the rich rather than the desires of the poor. There's often an agenda being visited on these ICDPs that does come from the global north. And by and large, again, this is a complicated literature, I would say one conclusion is that there's too little investment by the global north and too little protection for the local south to realize either biodiversity or development outcomes properly. We often find that there's a lose-lose in these cases, and not that we can't transition them to win-wins as the cases of Stuart and Peter, and I'm sure some of what Gretchen and Steve will talk about tomorrow. But when we go in optimistically thinking that it's a win-win, we sometimes create a lose-lose. Finally, just some closing observations about social norms. I would suggest that recent events might suggest limits on the strategy of relying on governments to deliver the global public good. But I would also, we're talking about social norms quite loosely here. We need to change social norms. And I would also say that recent events might make us cautious about that as well. So if social norms can change for good, they can also change for bad. And they change in very complicated ways, and there's actually not a bright line between regulation and shifts in social norms. And as a bit of an aside, I think recent events, going back probably 20 or 30 years with the rise of fundamentalism and ultranationalism and now populism and a rather surprising president in the United States, sort of alluding to Partha's comments this morning, I actually think all of those things are related, and I think they're related to a real questioning of our narrative of progress. That people are starting not to recognize that narrative as actual progress, or they're feeling left out. And I think that's for a later conversation. I think we have to redefine what we mean by progress. But I also, again, I caution against a sort of, I don't want to call it offhand, but this notion that we can rely on a shift in social norms when we don't really know how to shift social norms or how to control those shifts. And I was at a lecture recently by someone who was talking about leadership in a time of change, and she said, I don't need everyone to follow me, I just need some people to follow me. And so I actually think what we should be talking about here are not wide-scale shifts in social norms, but what segments of civil society we need to invest in, where we can get some inertia against both the vagaries of government and the vagaries of society so that we can sustain some forward action in this arena. And I think one of the reasons that we're all here is that we hope that organizations like the Catholic Church can contribute to that. Charles has pointed out some other places in civil society where we can try to create that inertia, but I think that would be more profitable as a place to focus than the broader, let's get the whole world on board with social norms. So, thank you very much.